Okay, I think we're about ready to get started in the first session of the afternoon. We have a session that's about policy, usability, a little bit more tracking, and HCI. So with that, Stephen, who was at Princeton University, is going to start the session for us.
Thank you for coming. I was at Princeton, just graduated last month. I defended my dissertation, and I'm now at Mozilla. And I just feel compelled to say this work doesn't represent their views, but we are really interested in tracking and what we can do about it. And so would love to hear any ideas you have there. So this was joint work with other folks at Princeton, Arvind Narayanan, my advisor, and Jeffrey Hahn, who's now at Facebook. And so today I'm going to be talking about email tracking. And this isn't the kind of email tracking you might think of when you hear that term. You might think sender tracking, right? Like a company knowing that you've opened up their mailing list, knowing that you've clicked through something like that, right? Or maybe a spammer knowing that you've opened up a spam email and they know you have a valid email address, right? That's what you might think about when you hear the term email tracking. But I'll show you that it's actually quite different, or perhaps a lot more than just that. And so I'm sure many of us have seen these kinds of warnings before, right? You go to your mail client, you go to open up a new mailing list email, and you get a message like this that says it contains blocked images. And maybe it says it contains blocked images, or it's blocked images to protect your privacy, like Thunderbird does. And so what does that mean, right? The problem is that most emails are completely unreadable unless you load images, right? If you were to open up something like this, maybe you could read through the alt text, try to figure out what's going on. But if you're anything like me, before I did this research, you would go and enable remote content, right? Now you're thinking, okay, it's coming from Bed Bath & Beyond. I'm a customer there. I don't care if they know I opened it. I'm going to be going to their website anyway, so why not just open it? You know, it's not a big deal. We'll allow the remote content to load. And so the core question that this research is trying to answer is, what are the privacy implications of making this very simple decision? And so if I'm a user who wants to figure that out, one thing I could do is check the help page. For example, for Thunderbird, I can go and say, why is remote content a problem? They have like a learn more link if you go into the preferences. And they say basically what I summarized at the beginning of the talk, which is, you know, a sender is going to know that you opened up the message, rough details about which application you're using, your geographic location through, you know, geolocation of the IP address, basic stuff like that. But let's take a look at what actually happens when you open up kind of a modern email from one of these mailing lists. And so I'm going to show you exactly what happens when we open up this Living Social email. If you just look at it, it looks pretty simple, right? It's loading a bunch of images related to some products from Living Social. You will notice that there's this, it's a bit small on the screen, there's a glasses.com ad within the email. So it's actually in the email content. So there's like, you know, display advertising happening. But when you open this, your device ends up contacting 24 different companies, 20 of which can track you if your mail client supports it, a bunch of them just by setting cookies, for example. And 10 of which receive an MD5 hash of your email address. And if you look at the companies receiving the hash, which is down in this corner of the screen, it's companies you probably recognize, right? People, large data brokers like Axiom and Newstar, people involved in web tracking like Criteo, and a bunch of the various ad exchanges that you'd experience in normal web tracking, you know, on a web browser. People like Oracle and Google through DoubleClick and Scorecard Research, ComScore. And why collect email address, right? Why collect a hash of an email address? Specifically, why collect email address to start? And I think it's really the perfect tracking identifier if you're a tracker. But if you're relying on cookies, a user might clear their cookies. Cookies are only for a specific device. But email kind of obviates all, gets rid of all of those problems, right? It's unique. It doesn't change. Person's not really rotating through email addresses. A user is going to sign in on their desktop device and then also on their mobile device with the same exact email, allowing them to be tracked across those two devices. And not only that, but consumers freely provide it in stores, right? Maybe you've been to a point of sale, you know, buying clothes or something, and they ask you, oh, would you mind to give your email address? So there's a lot of associated data with that identifier. And so you may be wondering, well, why receive a hash of it? If you dig into the privacy policies, the companies claim, oh, we receive hashes of it, or we hash it, specifically because it de-identifies the information. And even Criteo says they double hash it to ensure non-reversibility. So not really understanding the problem, And I won't focus too much on this exact issue, but maybe it's not so effective. So we actually have research. There's a article linked at the bottom of the slide here on freedom to tinker. If you just search for freedom to tinker 4 cents to de-anonymize, you'll find it. But basically, there are companies that offer de-anonymization services for these email hashes, just 4 cents per email, and you can get back you give in an MD5 hash, you'll get back an email address. If you double that to 8 cents, you'll actually get a bunch of consumer data as well. So you'll get back the person's real email address along with their name, their address, their phone number, and so on. So I think any claims that email address hashes are de-identified, really just this shows that that's not the case. And they claim a 70% success rate. And so for this study, we wanted to measure the emails themselves, right? So one of the challenges was to collect a data set of emails, of mailing lists specifically, in an automated fashion. And so we had to deal with signing up for mailing list signups that look like this, as well as registering for accounts, because sometimes the mailing list sign-up is part of the registration process. And we were able to succeed with mailing lists more so than with registrations. Basically, it's because it's a largely constrained problem, right? It's a relatively constrained set of fields that you have to enter, like your email, maybe your address, maybe your phone number. It's usually just 1 or 2 pages. And so there's a lot of detail in the paper about how we achieved that, what heuristics we used. I won't go through all of that here. But once we were able to successfully do that, we crawled about 16,000 sites, so the 15,000 of the Alexa top million, and then a bunch of sites within a bunch of shopping categories. And we signed up for mailing lists on each of those where we were able to successfully find a sign-up box. And we specifically gave each site a unique email address. Right? So then when we received email back from these various sign-up procedures, we would know what site that email corresponded to. So we received about 13,000 emails from almost 1,000 sites. And then we measured tracking with OpenWPM, which is an automation platform that we've built for running these kind of tracking measurement studies, and it uses Firefox. And so what we were able to do is say, well, email tracking is approximately web tracking without JavaScript. So we could use that crawler that we built for the web. We could disable JavaScript, we could disable referrers, and kind of make it seem like a webmail environment for the email. We could just render all of the received emails and then do network inspection to see who was setting cookies, if email addresses were leaking, if hashes of email addresses were leaking, and so on. So again, there's a lot more detail in the paper. Instead, I want to jump to some of our findings. And so what we found is, just as you saw in that Living Social email, many of the top web trackers are involved in email tracking as well. So we see DoubleClick, MathTag, we see BidSwitch. And actually, 85% of the emails we received had third parties of this type. It wasn't by no means, equally distributed. From some websites, you'd have things that looked like Living Social, where you'd have 24 different companies embedded. And from some emails, you'd have just 1 or 2. And we found that 30% of the emails we received from about 20% of the senders leaked the user's email address, either hashed or in plain text. And as you can see here, MD5 was the most common. That was one where we saw people basically leaking an email address and sharing that leaked and hashed address with a bunch of different companies. And then we saw a bunch of other ones, which SHA-1, SHA-256, and even some misuses where they double hash that didn't seem to be intentional. And this is an example of how one of those leaks occurs, right? So the email itself contains a pixel like the first URL at the top of this slide, right? That's what's embedded. And that URL may contain the user's email address, does here, for example. And then that redirects, and in this case, redirects 12 different times to a bunch of different companies. And actually, just to say, it seemed like the companies were dealing with butting up against redirect limits in browsers, and so they actually would embed multiple pixels, which would redirect through a bunch of different domains. So they actually needed more than just 12 redirects to do this. And so in this case, you see it redirect to this LIADM, which is a live intent domain, and it contains 3 different hashes of the email address. And we don't really know exactly why that is. My guess is it's something like they want to be able to link to data which may be coming in associated with one of those hashes. And then they redirect to a bunch of other domains, which are sharing things like bidder IDs and UUIDs. So it's kind of holding an ad auction after that. And again, purely speculation on my part, but I think the reason that we have this initial step where it's going to a first-party domain, this kind of subdomain from the first party, and then redirecting to a third-party domain with the hashes, is to say that the first-party domain never receives the plain text, or the third-party domain never receives the plain text email address. That's only kept on a first-party domain. And one of the big problems with these style of leaks is that it allows trackers to correlate that email address right into the web tracking graph. So traditionally, web tracking is happening with cookies. Users may not be logging in everywhere. So they're, a random identifier set on the device and used to track them across sites. And the problem is that when you have someone opening up an email with these kinds of leaks in it in a web browser, right, in a webmail client, what's going to happen is the tracker who receives that will not only receive the URL that contains that email embedded into it, but they're going to receive the cookie that they use to track the user around the web as well. And then they can make a linkage on the back end of associating that email address with that cookie. And then as they're tracking the user in the future on totally unrelated websites, right, where they see that cookie again, they'll know that it corresponds to that email address or that email hash that they also have in their database, the linkage created from the opening of the email. And actually, just kind of a shout out to some other ongoing research I have going on. The trackers are also harvesting this on the web. So this injection of email addresses into this tracking graph doesn't only happen when emails are open, but it also happens around the web. There's a link here at the bottom of the slide, and this is just a quick example, I won't step through it, of the trackers abusing autofill. So getting the browser to autofill a form that they control, grabbing the email address that's autofilled into that form, and sending out the hashed version of it to a bunch of different domains. So we did observe that happening. We observed it happening in a bunch of different scenarios, not just autofill. And so that kind of brings me to the question of, is identity-based marketing the future? In terms of the emails that where there actually were leaking email addresses, 4 of the top 5 providers are involved in something that they market as like people-based or identity-based marketing. So reaching consumers as specific individuals and reaching them across all the devices they own. And this seems to be the trend that not only email marketing, email tracking is going, but also web tracking. And so what can we do about it? Well, we went and did a survey of all the top clients, right, to see how well they would prevent this kind of attack. And as I showed with the Thunderbird help page at the beginning of the talk, it seemed like many of them had the wrong threat model, right? They were worried about cookies being set or basically the sender knowing that you've opened an email. And so the current defenses are a bit incomplete, right? Blocking cookies does prevent that linkage like I talked about before of your tracking cookie for the web with your email address, but it doesn't prevent linkage to IP address or, say, the passive fingerprint of your device. You could proxy image requests, which I think you're probably thinking Gmail does that, so this problem doesn't really apply. And that's true, the linkage won't happen if the image request is proxied, because the end server will never receive a request from your device. But that doesn't prevent this kind of targeted advertising or tracking of the fact that you're opening and which opening emails and which emails you're interacting with. And of course, you could block images. That is effective, but as I said before, emails are totally unreadable. And so we also did a measurement with ad blockers to see how well they helped users. And we found that it cut the leaks about in half, from 99 to 51, in terms of the number of recipients, and also in terms of the number of senders sending email addresses which leak, sending emails which leak email addresses. But the problem is they're not available on all platforms, and certainly they were missing these like email-only trackers. So it seemed like they were designed for the web. They weren't designed for the email trackers. And so what we proposed was perhaps we could take it a step further and not just hope that the user installs some kind of tracking protection, but actually have the service provider do filtering on the email right off the bat. So if the service provider would receive an email that looked like this, with, say, an image source tag from this tracking domain, what they could do is just pull that out of the HTML prior to delivering that to the user's mailbox. Then when the user opens it, that tracking pixel won't be there. So there are some problems there with redirects, but it actually does perform almost as well as AdBlock Plus or uBlock Origin being installed client-side when the email's open. And so the points I want to make here is that the line between web tracking and email tracking is blurry, and that we really do need better defenses for this, whether it's just doing measurement and adding to the filter lists, or if it's something else. and that there is a budding industry building around tracking with hashed identifiers, which is really hard to defend against in the browser. It's something I've been thinking about now that I'm at Mozilla, is what could we do to help this? And is policy the only solution, or is there something we can do in the browsers to prevent this kind of email address collection and email address-based tracking? So thank you. I'm looking forward to your input and questions.
All right. Please remember, if you have a question, wait for the mic to get to you.
I have the mic. Thanks for your talk. So the suggestion at the end of having the provider alter my email before giving it to me seems a little A, unpalatable, and B, it'll break like authentication, like DKIM and anything that one might use to check that an email is authentic.
Yeah, so I think the DKIM checks could happen prior to the provider doing this. This is really just the HTML that they present to you. And I'm thinking of this more in the webmail example, where they already are stripping, like Gmail, if you send an email with a JavaScript, with a script source, it will strip that out. Or if you send it with an iframe embedded, it will strip that out. So this would be like one additional step that those providers could do.
Webmail, yeah.
Yeah.
I saw a question over here.
Similarly, I guess I was wondering, you talked about ad blockers. Does would a specific tracker blocker like Privacy Badger or something, would that on a webmail client, would that have the same effect of stopping these, or does that not, because of the second level tracker, it wouldn't get there or something?
That's a really good question. I wonder whether, so Privacy Badger has this heuristic-based detection, right? And I imagine if there are some trackers that are only embedded in your mail client, so such that they're only ever loading on gmail.com or yahoo.com, because Gmail proxies, right? They're only ever loading on yahoo.com. I wonder whether Privacy Badger would still detect that as a tracker and block it. Yeah. I don't think they would with that heuristic.
They might want to add the ones that you found.
Yes, we do have a list. We have a list of the ones that were missed by EasyList, Easy Privacy.
Okay, we have a question over here.
Hi. So given that the sender of the email already has the email address, they could just share that email address directly with all these third-party partners that they've included in the email. So why do they bother looping it via the client and perhaps losing some of that connection?
Yeah, so I think the client connection there is to connect it into the web tracking graph. So to run like a programmatic advertising display ad within the email content itself. Actually, if you look through that, the LiveIntent, the largest company that receives these addresses, they say they do this to solve the Google proxying problem, so they can still serve targeted advertising in Gmail.
Are there other questions? I have a quick one. So you mentioned that hashing isn't a good protection scheme, and while it's clearly not sufficient, it does double the cost, right? It goes from 4 cents just for the information and 8 cents for undoing the hashing. So I would hate for someone to look at the paper and go, oh, well, I shouldn't do hashing either because I shouldn't even bother with the hashing. I'll just send them out in the clear.
I see. I think my fear with the hashing is that it's being used as justification for why it's okay to share this information. So I think if we all agreed that that's not sufficient, it would, I hope, reduce the amount of sharing instead of increase it. Because I've actually looked at marketing material, again, from some of these companies that's meant for first parties who would be advertising on this platform. It says, don't worry, we de-anonymize your data, you don't have to worry about certain data protection restrictions. Right. Wording like that, right?
Okay, well, let's thank the speaker.